G'day everyone, welcome to the Powerful Learning channel. My name's Luke Rowe, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about this topic of evidence-based teaching. In particular, we'll answer three different questions. The first question is going to be, what is evidence-based teaching? So we'll get into some conceptual models and conventional definitions about evidence-based teaching. The second question we'll try and answer is, why do we do evidence-based teaching in the first place? Why do we even need to look at the scientific literature to inform our teaching and learning practice? And the third and final question we'll try and answer is this idea of successful models of implementation. How can we successfully implement evidence-based teaching in various educational settings, first and foremost in the classroom? So, let's go. So let's begin by tackling the first question. What is evidence-based teaching in the first place? And one of the ways we can look into that question is to go back in history and look at where it came from in the first place. Now, the term evidence-based teaching comes from evidence-based practice, which itself stemmed from evidence-based medicine. So let's look into one of the definitions of evidence-based medical practice and see how that shapes up to inspire how we now define the term evidence-based teaching. So let me just quickly read this definition by Sackett. They suggested that evidence-based practice in healthcare is the conscientious, explicit and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of the individual patient. It means integrating individual clinical expertise with the best available external clinical evidence from systematic research. Now let's try and link this to the current definition of evidence-based teaching. And one of the definitions I like is in a 2014 report by Furlong in the British Association for Educational Research. It reads as follows. They consider evidence-based teaching as bringing together knowledge and evidence from different sources through a carefully sequenced program which is deliberately designed to integrate teachers' experiential learning at the chalk face with research-based knowledge and insights from academic study and scholarship. So in both instances of the evidence-based practice in medicine and evidence-based practice in teaching, we don't abandon our expertise and abandon our experience. We in fact use those together with the evidence to inform our practice and make our best decisions going forward. Now, the Australian Educational Research Organisation has another fantastic definition. They say evidence-based teaching has at least three characteristics. The first of those is using the best available evidence to inform decisions about what works best in education. The second is combining research evidence with professional expertise and local context to make informed judgments about the most effective ways to improve student outcomes. And the third characteristic is evaluating the impact of interventions and practices to ensure that they're achieving the desired results to inform future decisions. So not blindly accepting that just because the literature said this practice or this strategy would work, we're not blindly accepting that that will be the case when we apply it in the context of our classrooms. And I like that definition because it means that researchers like me don't get off the hook. We can't just dump evidence into the teaching community and hope it works. It's incumbent upon us. In fact, it says that we have a duty to ensure that we're building evidence where there is none, and to also inform our evidence inquiries in problems of practice, things that actually matter to the end users. Now, of course, if you hear different terminology, they're basically referring to the same thing. So whether it's evidence-based teaching, evidence-informed teaching, evidence-based practice, the clinical model of teaching, or evidence-based education, they're all pointing to the same thing. And the common thread there is they're looking back to the evidentiary literature, the scientific literature, so peer-reviewed literature that is falsifiable research and verifiable research, and it's undergone the scrutiny of experts in the field to suggest that this practice is going to give you a high probability of success. All right, so once it's passed that test, it meets the standard of evidence-based literature or evidence-based information that can then be translated into practice. Now, I've mentioned those three E's, the evidence, the experience, and the expertise coming together to inform our best judgments in what we do next in our classrooms. But of course, there's a broader context to consider, and that'll include the student needs, the learning environment, the contextual factors and the domain-specific aspects of what you're teaching and what the students are learning. So of course, we can't just use general principles in applied, highly specialized settings because they won't work. They won't transfer properly. So it's not to say that we ignore those things, but we start to do the work of integrating those things so that we can build a bridge between the evidence and our end users and the practice that we have to apply to get there. So in summary, evidence-based teaching is not so much a technique as a framework for introducing evidence from the peer-reviewed scientific literature to help integrate that with our expertise and our experience and deploy it in the context, the very complex context of a learning environment such as a school classroom. So it's putting that all together, throwing it all together, and knowing how to bake that cake. Now let's address this next question of why we should care about evidence-based teaching in the first place. And I like this quote by Helgerton and Mentor, who argued that educators are now in an evidence era where actions are justified through a language shrouded in talk of research, data, and best practice. But of course, one of the reasons why evidence-based teaching and evidence-informed practice is so compelling in education is because the results look good, they look promising, they look helpful, and they hopefully add value to the quality of our teaching and the learning experience for our students. Let's go through a few domains, including academic achievement, well-being, school attendance, and of course, lifelong learning. How does evidence-informed practice speak to those 4 points? Let's have a look. Now, to get our heads around this idea of how evidence can inform our practice in different ways to improve academic achievement for our students, we can look into the literature on feedback and metacognition. Let's have a quick look at feedback. So we see on the Evidence for Learning website, this is an Australian version of the Educational Endowment Foundation's process for delivering evidence in a way that's accessible and easily interpreted for teachers. They suggest that feedback is right up the top of the low-cost, high-impact strategies to improve academic achievement in students. They also point to metacognition and self-regulation as matching the same criteria, that is low-cost, high-impact strategies to improve academic achievement. On John Hattie's database, the Visible Learning MetaX database, we also see feedback ranks right up there with the remainder of his 300 plus influences and how they impact academic achievement. So when we look at metacognition and self-regulation, I've just mentioned that the same sources suggest that self-regulated learning and metacognitive strategies can help boost academic achievement without bankrupting schools and minimizing the resources that they have to expend in doing so. Let's have a quick look at some of the findings from the latest meta-analyses on self-regulated learning and metacognitive strategies in the classroom. DeBoer and colleagues found moderate effects, and that is a Cohen's d of 0.5, so a moderate effect on academic achievement, and it increased to 0.63 during long-term follow-ups. And that makes it a very unusual type of educational intervention because most educational interventions start to peter off and start to die down over time, so their potency of their effect diminishes with time. But in this case, it's suggesting that when you teach students to teach themselves, which is basically what self-regulated learning and metacognition try to achieve, that they can in fact create a positive feedback loop where they're learning how to learn and teach themselves, and it's improving their academic achievement downstream. And there are of course other studies such as the one by Creed and Phillips in 2011 that showed that there was a moderate correlation between the multiple strategies for learning questionnaire developed by Pintrich in the 1990s. And this of course addresses questions around self-regulated learning and metacognitive strategies. When they correlated that with GPA, as in grade point average in university students, they found a moderate to strong correlation. So again, we're seeing multiple strands of validating evidence for this whole idea of metacognitive and self-regulatory interventions in the classroom to boost academic achievement. So again, it's worth our time. Another interesting paper that I came across recently was by Grob Ophoff and colleagues in 2023. Let me just read some of the findings from that study. So the purpose of their study was to evaluate the claim that there is value in combining the approaches of database decision-making and evidence-informed education. They used a survey design with 1,457 staff members from 73 schools, so quite a large study, as well as school inspection ratings and pupil performance data. So what did they find? They found that schools with a higher average value of trust among colleagues report more organisational and research-informed activities, but also demonstrate better results in the average pupil performance assessment at the end of the school year. Now, the research climate itself was dependent on the trust and organisational climate within the school. High trust culture, then higher use of evidence in that school. High use of evidence in that high trust culture means better academic achievement for the students. Now, one of the criticisms of the evidence-based teaching movement is that it looks at just academic achievement, and we want so much more out of our educational experience than that. Now, there is a lot of research to show that the evidence-based teaching approaches can also impact things like well-being. Let's take a look at some of the research there. So there was a study by Beaton and colleagues in 2023 that looked at the impact of different strategies on the transition between primary school or elementary school and secondary school. They looked at strategies that helped in this review, and some of the things that worked were framing the transition positively, teaching coping skills explicitly to the students, reminding students of available social supports, and encouraging use of these. So there was a few different other things that they added to that. And then, of course, in the post-transition period, once they get there and months, weeks and months into their transition, they said that interventions that target student concerns about academic belonging and particularly social belonging early in the academic year have a big effect. They also said that, importantly, several of these interventions have the potential to reduce inequities with positive and some conventionally large effects demonstrated for students from traditionally disadvantaged backgrounds. So again, we're seeing highest impact where it's needed most. Now, what about this idea of school attendance? Right? If people can't show up to school in the first place, what's the point in learning all these evidence-informed strategies? You're going to have an impact on nobody. So let's have a look. In this review by Jennifer Freeman and colleagues, they looked into all of the factors that helped promote school attendance. They found at least 4 different categories. Skills training, such as life skills and use of public transport, making meals and study skills. Family supports, such as open and frequent dialogue between students, parents and teachers about attendance. Establishing positive relationships, say with partners and parents, and collaboratively problem solving with the students to involve them and give them some agency over those positive relationships. And then the 4th one was the case management supporters at different schools. So each school might have had teachers or staff or wellbeing officers assigned as case managers for those students, and they could engage with both the parents and the students for regular meetings to build trust and reinforce those interventions. So again, evidence-based teaching doesn't just mean book smarts, it means improving our ability to work in different dimensions of education. Now, what about this idea of lifelong learning? What does the evidence have to say about that? Well, I look to the work of the famous Harvard professor Raj Chetty to answer this question. He's got some fabulous work. Let's check it out. So Raj Chetty did some educational reviews. So he's an educational economist by training. And there's 2 famous papers, and I'm just going to check out this second paper. It's called Measuring the Impacts of Teachers, Part 2, Teacher Value Added and Student Outcomes in Adulthood. So what did he find in those major reviews across the USA? Well, he talks about this idea of teacher value added. So what do we mean by teacher value added? So Raj Chetty defines this idea of value added as a measure of the average impact or the test score impact gains for each of the teacher's students. And that can be adjusted, of course, for their prior learning. So once you put aside all of those prior learning confounds and adjust for those, the teachers who are in the top 5% of value added distribution have positive effects on student test scores, college attendance, lifetime earnings, and they reduce the likelihood of teenage pregnancy. The conclusion that he made was that great teachers create great value in the lives of learners. And finally, to round out our answer to this question of why we should do evidence-based teaching in the first place, I'm going to look to a quote by the great Professor David Hargraves. He said this, "Teaching is not at present a research-based profession. I have no doubt that if it were, teaching would be more effective and more satisfying. The goal of enhancing effectiveness and satisfaction can be achieved only by a combination of several means, of which an adequate research base is just one. It is, in my view, a singularly important one which deserves to be given priority. So you heard it from Professor Hargraves. Evidence can add value to the students' lives, but it can also mean that we're more effective at our jobs as educators, and that in itself can make it more meaningful to us. So do you agree with Professor Hargraves? I'd love to hear your opinion, so feel free to pop that in the comments section below. Now let's answer our third and final question on how we can successfully implement evidence-based teaching and learning in our classrooms and various educational contexts. One of the ways we can do that, of course, is to look at models, or what we call translation or implementation models, that have helped address this question of how we can best mobilize knowledge from the research into the classroom. Let's have a look. So one of the models that we can look to, as you'll see on screen, is by Levin in 2013, and that was published in the British Educational Research Foundation's report. They looked at three major characteristics of successful knowledge mobilization or knowledge translation from research to practice. They talked about the production of that knowledge, that research by the universities and others. They talked about the policymakers and the practitioners as the end users, and so you'll see the arrow joining those two between production and use, and that of course is pointing to the idea that those who produce the evidence should always do it in collaboration with the end users, the policymakers and the practitioners. And of course, we should talk about these things as mediated by individual organizational processes. Right? So we know that individual schools will have their own processes that will make them more predisposed or less predisposed to the use and uptake and implementation of evidence. And we've got to pay attention to those contextual factors in order to have successful translation of evidence into practice. Another well-known model is by my mentor and my old boss, John Hattie, who talks about this idea of visible learning. So let's take a closer look at what that term visible learning actually means. So the notion of visible learning is to not just assume that learning is happening because teachers are speaking. It helps the student see their own learning by making it visible, and it also means that if the student can see their learning because it's been made visible in some way, it helps the teacher see the student's learning. And from that observation, the student and the teacher can monitor changes from various approaches and strategies that they've applied to their learning, and to see if they're making achievements and increasing their achievements, to see if they're making progress. Students also start to see what teaching helps their own learning, and they learn to become their own teachers. And if you're familiar with John Hattie's work, you'll see that he bangs on about this idea over and over again, that one of the highest goals of the educator is to make themselves redundant by helping students become their own teachers. So let's get a bit more practical here. Now, one of the acronyms that John uses to help teachers remember what steps to take in implementing evidence in their classroom is the DIE model, where he says that teaching is to die for. What does he mean by that? He means diagnosis, that's the D, intervention, that's the I, and evaluation, that is seeing where the value is in your intervention. Right? And if there's no value, throw it away, try something new. So teaching is to die for, diagnosis, intervention, evaluation. Now, if you read Hattie's most recent work, that is Visible Learning, the sequel, you'll see that he's now updated this with his work with Janet Clinton, who's an organizational and educational psychologist, and they looked at the implementation sciences to give them a sense of how to successfully mobilize evidence at scale in schools and various educational sectors. They called it the 5D model. So let's take a quick look at that. They found in their review to successfully implement evidence, they've got to discover, design, deliver, double back, and double up. So what do we mean by those 5Ds? Well, John elaborates in his book by suggesting that the first D, discovery, is discovering goals and what students walk into the class knowing already. So their prior knowledge and what they hope to achieve in terms of changing that prior knowledge into something new. The next one is designing high probability interventions. So that's the second D. The third one is delivering the implementation of the interventions. The fourth one is doubling back and monitoring and evaluating the impact. So looking back to see what happened and was it successful. And then of course, either doubling up to scale up if it worked, or stopping that and going back to the shelf and choosing something else that is likely to work. Now, of course, I encourage you to buy John's book, Visible Learning, the sequel, if you want to know more about this model. Now, of course, there are many other successful models out there. One of the ones that's well known where I'm from is the High Impact Teaching Strategies document. And as you can see there are 10 different strategies: setting goals, structuring lessons, explicit teaching, worked examples, collaborative learning, differentiated teaching, feedback, questioning, metacognitive strategies, and multiple exposures. Right, so you can take a look at the document. You can Google the High Impact Teaching Strategies document. It'll be the first thing that comes up if you want more details. So let's quickly summarize some of the common threads that we found in this implementation model. I've got 5 of them, and I've put together a nice visual diagram to walk us through those 5 key characteristics of successful implementation models that will help us get evidence from the research labs into the classroom. The first thing we've got to do is start with why. That is the purpose of the research in the first place, and the purpose of why you're looking to the evidence to inform your next steps in your teaching and learning. One of the questions that I encourage you to ask is this evidence helping to promote human flourishing? Is the research solving a problem that exists, or is it adding value? The second point is the quality of the research. Now, this is a big space that's definitely being debated amongst the researchers and the research community about what constitutes high quality evidence. But there are at least 3 characteristics that I think that everyone should look out for. That is large samples, robust design, such as a randomized control trial, and impartial replication. So if the study was done once, I would never trust it. If the study was done 100 times and it produced the same result, and what I mean by impartial replication, that's called replication, but it could have been by the same researcher. That's not impartial at all. We always confirm our biases, and what you'll see in the literature is time and time again, researchers confirm their prior results. So what we want to see is an impartial confirmation of prior results by some independent research laboratory, so that you're not getting the same research lab like an echo chamber producing the same results over and over again. We want to see that independently replicated across different contexts with different students and different researchers. Now, the third component is this interpretive component, right? So when you read the research, are you accurately and faithfully reading that research according to the results that were in that research? Are you having and producing a shared understanding amongst your colleagues so that there's no miscalibrations between you and your colleagues about what that research means? And do you have checks and balances in there to ensure that your research interpretation is faithful to the original research? Now, the fourth dimension here is this idea of implementation. So you could understand the research, it could be high quality research, and it could be very purposeful, but unless you implement it faithfully with high fidelity, it could all fall flat. So let's look at those characteristics. One of the things we've got to do to ensure that higher probability of success is to implement according to the methodology or the methods that we use to produce those results in the first place. The second point is differentiated and adapted implementation so that you can meet the unique needs of your learners and your learning environment. And the third thing there is just to mention the enablers and barriers. They'll be different for each educational setting. So some schools will have great resources to help ease the implementation. Other schools might have big barriers that stand between you and the implementation of evidence. Now, the fifth and final aspect of this evidence-based teaching model is, of course, the evaluation. That is, knowing what sort of impact you had. Okay, so let's summarize those key points. The first one was that we answered the question of what is evidence-based teaching. We looked at a few conceptual definitions, and we also contrasted that and saw the historical roots of how that emerged in evidence-based teaching from its roots in medicine. The second thing we looked at was why we do evidence-based teaching in the first place. And I point to David Hargraves's quote that says it's a more meaningful and effective way to teach. And of course, I provided lots of evidence to substantiate those claims. The third and final thing that we looked into is this idea of implementation models, how we can successfully move the evidence from the laboratory to the classroom and contextualize it in a meaningful and purposeful manner in your schools. So that's the end of this episode. Next time we're going to talk about this idea of the research-practice divide. Thank you so much for watching. If you got value out of this episode, hit the thumbs up and share it with a friend. And if you feel like you don't want to miss out on future episodes, hit the subscribe button and we'll see you in the next episode.